Why are the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer? Well, scarce assets keep going up in price. Real estate, equities, art, gold, all of these things. Young people can't afford it. Poor people can't afford it. A global taxation of 8% a year that you don't understand. You just don't get richer by 8% a year. Add in another 3% global inflation. You're at 11% debasement of currency. That's your hurdle rate to stay as wealthy as you are today. That's a staggeringly difficult thing, considering most asset classes don't produce those kinds of returns. You get to the S&P 500, you're at 12%. Basically, you break even. So owning US equities in the broadest sense makes you no money either. Bitcoin since 2012, 27.5 million% returns. Again, nothing ever has remotely come close to this. That's when I made the mistake around this time of year, thinking, you know what, I'm going to sell my Bitcoin at 2,000. I bought it at 200 in 2013. It went to 20,000 at the end of the year, and I felt like a complete moron. That's how not to do things. That's called fucking it up. And so I'm trying to teach you how not to do that. Put Bitcoin at $850,000.
最近美元大跌，台币大涨，很多人换回台币就亏了10%以上。没想到金融知识教育平台 Real Vision 的创办人 Raoul Pal 上周在杜拜演讲就成功预测了美元贬值、台币升值的趋势。那接下来会怎么样？我们又该如何投资？投资科技股，但是报酬率低于比特币；投资比特币，但是暴涨暴跌，心脏受不了。我们该怎么选择 ？Raoul Pal 像吃了诚实豆沙包一样。竟然说这次美元大贬值是川普故意的，目的就是为了让美国继续控制全球经济。如果你是领台币薪水，现在要换成美元吗？还是要投资美股或是比特币？或是领美元薪水的你，明明什么都没做，换台币直接亏10%，正在寻找更好的投资机会？还是你在比特币10万元投资，现在不知道该继续买还是卖出？如果你想知道美国接下来会怎么出招，千万别错过这次的影片。嗨，我是 Emma， 带你在币圈趋势中打造属于自己的被动收入。在我们开始前，可以请你帮个忙吗？ YouTube 后台显示有76%的观众还没订阅频道。如果你喜欢我们的影片，免费支持我们的方式就是点下订阅按钮，每周日都能收到币圈最新的消息，更不会错过任何的财富密码哟。谢谢。
Okay, so I'm going to go through some slides that will give you an idea of where we are in the economy and where we are in markets, just to steady everyone's nerves, because all everybody sees is headlines, the world's going to shit, everything's going to die, the world is going to war, all of this stuff. The reality is it something much better? Let's see if I can figure this out. So firstly, I use a framework that I call the everything code. It's something that I've spent 35 years building in macro, where I started to realize that the dominant factor in all of macro is actually liquidity and the debasement of currencies, and it explains most price movements in all of the assets that we care about. And I realized that it's all to do with debt, and it came from why we're seeing 4-year cycles in crypto and the economy and all of these things is actually driven by the debt refi cycle. The world just reached too much debt back in 2008, and what we've been doing since then is servicing the debt. We've also got some other key factors. This chart is a chart that I produced a few years ago. It's still the single most important chart in macro and explains everything that is going on in our world today. And this is the fact that demographics is everything, and the demographics of the aging populations across the Western world, these are the US numbers using the labor force participation rate, explain the build-up in debt. Why that is as populations get older, economies slow down. To service the existing debt, it requires more debt. To create GDP growth, you need more debt. See, GDP growth is driven by population growth, productivity growth, and debt growth. And debt growth has been the driver both in the US, in China, in Europe, in the UK, all across the world. It's all driven by the same dynamic, and that's this aging population thing. It slows down GDP growth and creates unstable economies. And that chart just shows the stunning correlation between debt to GDP and population itself. what's interesting is then when you go one stage further and say, okay, we're seeing this debt, how are we dealing with this debt? And it's actually just driven by liquidity. So here I'm using Fed net liquidity. Fed net liquidity is the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury General Account, which is the Treasury themselves, not the Fed, and then the reverse repo facility. These are the levers that they've been using. It started just using the balance sheet, 2009, all the way through to about 2014, it was just the use of the balance sheet. Then they started sneaking in new ways of debasing currency, and that was by adding in these other levers, getting banks to put reserves here or take reserves out there, or injecting money into the economy via the checking account, the Treasury General Account. That's actually shifted to total liquidity now because everyone figures out the game, which is the debasement of currency, debase the currency, try and grow GDP growth at lower debt to GDP or just manage it. Now they're using total liquidity, which includes measures like M2, which is the banking system as well.
简单来说，全球经济从2008年到现在看起来很好的背后，不是因为人口数量大爆发，或是生产力迅速提高，而是因为债务增加的速度更快，才推动了股市、房市大涨，营造出全球经济很好的假象。很讶异吧？但是债务就是先消费未来的钱，那未来还不起该怎么办呢？聪明的美国政府想到一招解决，透过货币贬值让债务变便宜，不就减轻还债压力了吗？举例来说，小 A 和小 B 借10美元，约定好5年后还10美元。在2020年，10美元可以买6颗巧克力，但到了2025年，10美元只能买1颗巧克力。所以表面是小 A 确实在5年后还10美元，但是小 B 拿到的10美元价值已经减少，买不起6颗巧克力。这就是为什么最近新台币对美元急速升值，1美元原本能换32元台币，却在短短2天急速升值快10%，变成只能换29元台币，吓到银行宕机。5月5日，台湾央行总裁说，升值原因是台湾经济表现良好，再加上美国总统川普宣布暂缓对等关税，请大家冷静，别太激动。但真的是这样吗？5月6日，韩国央行总裁说出真相，近期亚洲货币狂升值，就是因为美国施压。但为什么美国要让自己的货币贬值呢？因为当新台币升值、韩元升值、美元贬值时，那美国的还债压力不就减少了吗？这就等于美国让全台湾、全亚洲的人一起为美国人的消费买单。难道我们普通人就只能这样被压着打吗？难道我们就只能一辈子帮美国人民打工吗？你愿意这样吗？底下留言。我当然不愿意，但又能怎么办？让 Raw 炮告诉我们。
So here's the real issue here. Why are the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer? Well, scarce assets keep going up in price. Real estate, equities, art, gold, all of these things. Young people can't afford it. Poor people can't afford it because they've got variable income, which is earnings, and it buys them less of these every year. What's actually happening, what that mechanism is a tax on everybody of 8% a year. A global taxation of 8% a year that you don't understand. You just don't get richer by 8% a year. Add in another 3% global inflation, you're at 11% debasement of currency. That's your hurdle rate to stay as wealthy as you are today. That's a staggeringly difficult thing, considering most asset classes don't produce those kinds of returns, which is why so many young people have come to crypto, because crypto completely upends this system. They can't buy houses, they can't buy all of the other things that older people were able to afford. So they forced into more speculative, higher risk assets that have much higher returns. It's the only way out of the trap. And the trap is driven by this debasement. So if you want to see how close the correlation is, and I'll show the full correlation chart later, it basically drives Bitcoin. And what we see is there's periods where it decouples, and these are the banana zones. It decouples when what we get is the retail frenzy and the frenzy into the market, cools off, comes back to trend rate of this debasement of 8% or so. But over time, it produces astonishing returns. And that's why Bitcoin looks like this on the log regression channel. It's also still remarkably cheap. Where it ends up at the end of the banana zone is usually the 1 or 2 standard deviation level. We're a long way from that, and that would give us much higher prices. You can't see it on this. But if it were to get to 2 standard deviations, that would put Bitcoin at $850,000. I don't think it's going to go there, but what we're saying is there's plenty of upside to come. I know people get frustrated in sideways markets. It's just the nature of the beast. It does nothing, corrects for a while, and then explodes out of the traps. And we're kind of in that phase now that I'll talk to you about. When we talk about debasement of currency, you can't see this very easily, but at the top here is, well, these are all of the asset classes that we monitor at Xpan, my asset management firm. And you can see that most of the returns of US small caps, REITs, treasuries, preferred stocks, high yield bonds, they're all annualizing at less than 10% a year returns. So owning those assets makes you actually poorer because of the debasement. Once you get to the S&P 500, you're at 12%. Basically, you break even. Divide the S&P 500 by global total liquidity, it's basically a flat line. But owning US equities in the broadest sense makes you no money either. So all of the millennials who've been piling money into 401ks are not getting richer. So none of their 401ks will buy them as much of a house and stuff like that. Only when you get to technology investing do you start beating the benchmark. And so this realization from the Everything Code is debasement of currency. There are only 2 assets that matter in the entire world. 1 is technology, and 2 is crypto. And crypto dwarfs everything else. It is the greatest performing asset in all recorded history. We've never had anything like this before. So here's Bitcoin since 2012, 130% annualized. That's including 3 gigantic drawdowns. Ethereum at 113 and Solana at 142. So, and Solana obviously starts later. So the magnitude of the returns is enormous. The volatility we have to stomach to do it is the game. And it's a matter of, I've told everybody about the don't fuck this up thesis of how to deal with volatility, how not to lose control of your tokens, because this stuff compounds over time. Bitcoin since 2012, 27.5 million% returns. Again, nothing ever has remotely come close to this. So that's the opportunity. And we said the tech stocks, they're great, and Bitcoin or crypto is great. Fantastic. Then you look at the NASDAQ versus Bitcoin, it's down 99.94%. Crypto is a supermassive black hole that simply outperforms and sucks every other asset dry. This is the big one, the biggest one we've ever been given, the greatest macro opportunity of all time.
还记得10年前我刚出社会时，其实连股票都不太敢投资，因为工作赚钱很辛苦，很担心股票一下跌，今天就做白工了。有人跟我一样的想法吗？有。直到我了解货币贬值的速度有多快，像是最强势的货币美元，在过去100年来贬值超过96%。即便我们投资大盘标普500，长期来说只是维持资产价值，也没有赚钱。更何况，如果只放在银行，那等于自愿被抢劫。你愿意每天辛苦工作赚到的薪水自动减少吗？如果不愿意，那真的要好好检视一下。目前你的资产每年有成长超过10%吗？如果没有，那该怎么办？跟上最新的趋势，投资币圈。但是新手该怎么投资币圈才安全？这么多诈骗，该怎么辨识？所以今天我想把最新写的这本书自由免费的送给你。我浓缩自己投资币圈4年来暴富到8位数，又赔了90%，直到现在稳定获利的投资秘密。新手该如何投资币圈赚钱？分享安全又快速的3大步骤，并且准备常见的50个币圈专有名词，帮助你轻松理解市场，从此远离诈骗。你可以在资讯栏的第1条连结中免费领取自由。这不仅是一本投资币圈指南，而是我如何从每天工作12小时的上班族，透过币圈成功开除老板，每天睡到自然醒的翻身经历。 如果今天你错过领取自由的机会，那明天势必要用时间、金钱和精力去换取这些经验，这样不是很累吗？而且只要按照书中的步骤投资，不仅达成分散风险，更能在30天帮自己增加一份投资收入。来自台湾、杜拜、香港等超过60位上班族们都已经达成了。下一位远离危机、安全投资的人会是你吗？
And to go back to that idea that the Trump cycle is repeating, I mean, it's an incredible repeat, but more powerful even than 2017. Those of us who were in crypto in 2017, that's when I made the mistake around this time of year, thinking, you know what, I'm going to sell my Bitcoin at 2,000. I bought it at 200 in 2013. It went to 20,000 at the end of the year, and I felt like a complete moron. And I managed to buy it back in the sell-off in COVID, and I bought it back at 6,500. So I sold it at 2,000 and bought it back at 6,500. That's how not to do things. That's called fucking it up. And so I'm trying to teach you how not to do that. So the dollar, Trump last time around, same thing. The markets priced in tariffs. The dollar screamed higher. It created this weak patch of growth. Trump came out and said the dollar's too high. Guess what? Scott Bessent, who's a macro hedge fund manager, I've known him for 20 years, 25 years. He understands the game. Trump said the same thing. Everyone said the same thing. The dollar's too strong. And hey presto, the dollar has utterly collapsed. And we haven't started yet. And it's a cyclical thing. It's not the end of the dollar. That's another narrative you read. There can't be the end of the dollar right now because 87% of world trade is in dollars and 50% of the entire world's debt are in dollars. So that's 200% of global GDP is actually in dollars. So there's a shortage of dollars globally, and that won't go away for a long time. So the dollar's collapsing. This kind of thing is a massive tailwind. As the dollar weakens, it means that the more global exports pick up. Everybody who's a foreigner who services US government debt, it's cheaper to service the debt, costs them less of their domestic currency cash flows. So it's a very powerful setup. A weak dollar is incredibly good for world growth. It allows China, everybody else to start exporting. The whole world economy starts picking up. The last time this happened, the Trump cycle, well, that was the initial correction that we got. We had this whole period of correction, much like we've had now. It stopped in about March. Well, we got to about April. And then we did this. And from that correction low, it did a 23x. Now, I don't expect Bitcoin to do a 23x, because this was much earlier in its adoption curve, but some of the others will, something close to it. We've got a perfect setup, one of the best setups I've ever seen, because we know the debt has to be rolled, we know the forward-looking liquidity is coming, and we know how assets react to it. So it's like having a crystal ball. Nothing will be perfect, but directionally, it should be right.
但我们投资者遇到最大的问题就是，明明知道比特币是好资产，但看到价格暴跌就不自觉紧张、焦虑，又听到爸妈、同事说这不安全，就感到很恐慌。难道投资币圈一定要承受这么大的压力吗？有没有什么低风险的投资机会呢？还真的有，而且比你想的更简单。透过放贷，将资金借给交易员，每天就能赚到稳定的利息，报酬率高于美国标普500和台湾房地产，但风险远低于直接投资比特币交易合约。再也不用担心晚上睡觉时手机通知币价暴跌亏钱，而是每天早上起床时账户就自动多了一笔收入。像最近关税大战，我收到来自台湾的学员分享，我觉得好险我有做一些放贷，不然我这一波就完蛋了。还收到来自香港的学员分享，放贷1年多了，最近放出的利息是我有史以来最高的，忍不住要留影纪念。所以如果你不想要越来越穷，但也不愿意资产承受暴涨暴跌，那说不定放贷会很适合你哦。去年我还受邀到香港分享币圈投资经历，希望能避免新手再犯下我过去的错误，不用走弯路就能在币圈投资赚钱，过上每天睡到自然醒的生活哦。所以我准备了一个免费教学影片，分享自己是如何从什么都不懂的币圈韭菜，到现在成功打造一份稳定安心的被动收入。你可以在资讯栏的第2条连结中找到。按照影片步骤，只要30天就能达成分散风险，在币圈安心赚钱。相信明年的你会非常感谢现在的自己。听完今天的分享，你会选择 A. 乖乖拿着台币， B. 把握时间换成美元。C. 跟上趋势投资比特币。D. 投资放贷最安心。为什么？欢迎留言分享你的看法。我是 Emma， 还会继续分享关于币圈投资被动收入的经验。记得按赞、订阅、开启旁边的小铃铛，并打开全部，还有 follow 我的 IG 哦，那你就不会错过这些知识了。我们下周见，拜拜。